India should seek to diversify its export markets and not rely too much on one country or two countries. Until then, I think it would be useful if the government could provide some targeted and time-bound support for these sectors which are hurt by tariffs. If you want to compete, if you want to scale up, and you want to compete like with China, it's very important that you have the ability for firms, you provide the ability for firms to scale up. So on the global economy itself, we have a growth forecast of 3.2% for this year, which is about 0.4 percentage points higher than what we had in April. If investors choose to postpone decision on where to invest, how to much, and so on and so forth, that could dampen economic activity.
Hello and welcome to Tracking Trump on DeKoder. I'm Nidhi Razdan. Well, President Trump has done it again. He has had a Diwali conversation with Prime Minister Modi, and once again he has claimed that India will not be purchasing Russian oil. He has suggested that India has agreed to dial back its purchases of Russian oil. The Indian side has not commented on this conversation and the contents of it, except for a tweet or rather an X post from the Prime Minister, which acknowledged the Diwali greetings from the US President. But we have to remember why this is so important, because the punitive tariffs that have been imposed on India by the Trump administration are on the back of these purchases of Russian oil. And for India, this is, of course, a very tight diplomatic balancing act that it's trying to do while trying to negotiate a trade deal with the United States as well. In the middle of all this, Trump's tariffs, of course, have kicked in, and Indian exporters in particular are feeling the pinch. It is hurting the Indian textile sector, for example, jewelry sector, and those that really had the US as a huge market. We don't know how long this could go on, how long we'll feel the pain. But despite all these headwinds, the International Monetary Fund has recently come out with its report revising India's growth projections for this fiscal. In fact, they suggest that India could grow a little better than was earlier expected, although the growth projection for the next year, 2026-27, has been slightly lowered, perhaps factoring in the long-term impact of Trump's tariffs. Well, let's talk to Krishna Srinivasan, the director of the Asia and Pacific Department of the International Monetary Fund. He's joining us from Hong Kong on DeKoder today. Thank you very much, Mr. Srinivasan, for joining us on this. Before I get to India specifically, I just wanted to get a sense from you on where the global economy kind of currently stands at the moment in your view in the wake of these tariffs. Would it be right to say that it's not so painful just yet, but we could begin to feel the pain over the next few months?
Thank you, Nidhi. Good to be with you. So on the global economy itself, we have a growth forecast of 3.2% for this year, which is about 0.4 percentage points higher than what we had in April. And then we have for next year, we have 3.1%, which is about 0.1% higher than what we had in April. And the reason why we have revised our forecast upward is because, number one, that the tariffs have been lower than what we had projected in April. So in April, we made the assumptions for tariffs, they were much higher. And so with countries negotiating deals with the US, the effective tariff rate is lower this now than they were in April. The other issue, which I would say, is macro fundamentals have been very strong, and many of the firms have been pretty active in front-loading investment and exports, which has given a fillip to growth in the region, both here and in the world generally. So those are the key two reasons, and financial conditions have been quite supportive. So if you put all these factors together, it gives you a basis for revising growth up. Now you had asked a question also on India. On India, we have revised up our growth forecast 6.6% this year, which is about 0.4% higher than what we had in April. And you're right that for 2026, we have it at 6.2%, going down from 6.6 to 6.2%. I can explain that. For India too, the reasons being that there are a couple of very strong tailwinds, and then of course the headwind is some tariffs. So we had a very strong first quarter at 7.8%, and we also have the GST reforms, both of which provide some support to the economy. On the other hand, you have tariffs, which kind of are a significant headwind. If you put these two factors together, we have growth of 6.6% for this year. But for next year, the way we do our projections, we assume that the 50% tariff stays. And that's why we have growth going down to 6.2%. If India is able to negotiate a deal which lowers the tariffs well below that, then there's an upside risks of growth next year.
How much is the uncertainty of what President Trump is doing also going to impact not just India but the world in the year ahead? Because, like you said, we don't know whether the tariffs will still be 50% in 6 months from now or whether they'll be 15%. But he has a new idea every day. He's woken up today and said, well, China might be stuck with 155% tariff. So all of this has huge ramifications for everyone.
So the uncertainty part, Nidhi, you're absolutely right, is very high in April. It's gone down a bit now, but still uncertainty remains. And that's a big headwind for growth in general. And why is that? Because when you have such uncertainty, investors, firms try to put off decisions on where to invest, how much to invest, and so on and so forth. So that could be a significant drag on growth, economic activity everywhere in the world, including in Asia and India also. So that's something which we identify as a key downside risk, that with uncertainty remaining high, if investors choose to postpone decision on where to invest, how to much, and so on and so forth, that could dampen economic activity. So you're absolutely right that uncertainty is a key factor in how we see the global conjuncture.
Now, again, coming to some specifics about India, I mentioned the textile sector, for example, being badly hit, Indian exporters. And in fact, data from one of their confederations shows that about 34% of textile businesses are reporting that their sales revenue has reduced by half in the last few months as a result of Trump tariffs. What do these sectors do in a situation like this? Do they turn to other markets? I was reading today that the shrimp exporters in Andhra are looking at maybe Australia as a market. Is that the only choice they have now? Looking at other markets.
So let me break it up for you, Didi, in a couple of ways. One, of course, is there are some sectors which are clearly hurting: textiles, jewelry, shrimp. These are sectors which are hurting. But if you look at overall exports of India to the US, it's about 2% of GDP. If you look at the trade with the US, about 2% of GDP. So there is a micro impact, there's a macro impact. At the micro level, these sectors are getting affected quite significantly. And what we are recommending is that the government can provide timely, targeted, and temporary support to these sectors, so that they have some buffers which they can build up. So we are talking about the government providing targeted support for this industry. But overall, I would say that going forward, and even starting now, India should seek to diversify its export markets and not rely too much on one country or two countries. And the recent agreements with the UK and agreements being signed or first being made to sign the free trade agreements with Europe, Australia, and so on. All those will go towards diversifying your markets. But clearly, in the near term, they need help. Of course, the question is the trade negotiations are still ongoing. But until then, I think it would be useful if the government could provide some targeted and time-bound support for these sectors which are hurt by tariffs.
Would you also say that this entire sort of tariff crisis is also an opportunity for India to perhaps push forward some deeper structural reforms economically? Look, I think we all agree that India is perhaps more protectionist than it needs to be. So is there an opportunity here to course correct without necessarily going into the more sensitive areas? And I'm quoting you here that you said recently that India needs to fire all cylinders to reach that growth target of 8% or more. So is this an opportunity actually in crisis?
So I would again look at it from 2 points of view, Nidhi. One is on the external side. Yes, clearly we have an opportunity here to diversify our markets, sign free trade agreements with countries. Also, India can think about more multilateral agreements like RCEP and CPTPP, which are all will head towards diversifying markets and so on. But going beyond that, India has a large domestic market, and so there is clearly room to strengthen domestic demand. And I think that's where structural reforms are very, very important. And there I would break it up into some which can be done in the near term and some which might take longer. In the near term, we have talked about the fact that this is an opportunity for India to liberalize its trade. And why is that? Because if India needs to compete with the likes of China, then you'll have to have greater trade liberalization so that firms can import inputs at a cheaper cost, they can compete. And related to that is, implementing our labor codes. Because if you want to really compete in the global market, you should be able to scale up and so on. So that's where I think it's important that you work on liberalizing your trade, implementing your labor codes, improving your business environment. All this is very important because I think, as I said, if you want to compete, if you want to scale up, and you want to compete like with China, it's very important that you have the ability for firms. You provide the ability for firms to scale up, and that's very important. Going beyond that, I think it's important to think in terms of deeper structural reforms involving land, labor, agriculture, education. I think it's very, very important that India makes a very concerted effort to revamp how you educate, how the education system, in terms of skilling your labor and so on and so forth. So because in addition to this being an opportunity, you also have, opportunity from AI. And that's where I think revamping your education system is extremely important. So these are more longer term reforms. In the short term, I would say liberalize your trade, implement your labor codes, improve the business environment. The GST reform is a big step in that direction. I think all these are things you need to compete in the global arena.
But you do know that that kind of reform in India often comes at a huge political risk. So it's not easy.
It's not easy, absolutely. So I think this is where you have to think in terms of how do you prioritize your reforms and see how much of public support there is for reforms. You've done this in countries elsewhere in the world. Not too long ago, Brazil looked at this and said, how do I prioritize structural reforms? Which ones have more public support? So you find an intersection between the prioritization of reforms and the public support for it, and that's a good way to map how much you can do over a period of time. But clearly, these structural reforms will require a lot of political capital. It will require greater coordination between center, state, and even local administration. So these are not easy, but they are much needed if India has to reach its target of being a developed country by 2047. So this Viksit Bharat goal implies a growth of at least 8%, and that's what I meant by saying you have to fire on all cylinders.
And therefore, linked to that are the India-US trade negotiations, which are currently underway, and these aren't easy negotiations. What would you say is a win-win deal for both sides in this? And you know what the red lines are for India.
So we are not privy to these negotiations. I think very few people are privy to these negotiations. So I'm not going to talk to that issue of what should be our objective, what should be the US objective. What I would say is that given the uncertainty you talked about, Nidhi, and trade tensions, and given how much firms, consumers, will really appreciate having greater certainty. I think it's important that countries work constructively to promote a stable and predictable trade environment and address these shared challenges, right? So I think it's important a swift conclusion of agreement that meets both countries' interests would be welcome in supporting bilateral trade and reducing policy uncertainty. So as I said, Nidhi, we are not party to these negotiations and as such have no insight into the specifics of any proposal that may be being discussed.
When we were talking about, India reaching that goal of being a fully developed economy by 2047, one of the big concerns here is the way India is growing. Is this an uneven growth, where that sort of K-shaped growth that we keep talking about, where, yes, there is a section of the economy that's doing well, maybe certain fundamentals are strong, but there, it's not trickling down necessarily, to the poorest, to the middle class. Is that a concern, and how does India bridge that gap? It's the biggest challenge we face.
So there are pluses and minuses. India has clearly grown pretty fast over the last few years. It's improved lives and livelihoods for sure. If you look at extreme poverty, that's at 5%. So things have improved, and people are enjoying better livelihoods. The question, of course, is going forward, how do you make sure that everybody is part of the success story? And I think that is where it's important that these structural reforms come into play. You improve the quality of education. You make sure that people have the right skills to take advantage of a growing economy, to take advantage of transformations like AI, so that everybody's part of the growth process. So I think that is where it's important to think in terms of deeper structural reforms which will bring everyone together in this growth momentum.
Last couple of questions. One is, when you look at the world economy today, are you concerned that we're sort of heading into, or we've already come into this era of more and more protectionism? It's not just the Americans, but other countries as well. Everyone is kind of working in these silos. And therefore, what does that mean for world trade, the global economic order as we knew it?
So I think I would like to make a plug for some of the work we have done for Asian integration. So one thing we have talked about, with Asia, Asia is one region which has benefited a lot from open trade. Lots of jobs have been created and so on. But now you see these trade tensions rising. So one thing which we are talking about is for Asia in general, and it applies for countries including Asia. There is you could pivot towards greater domestic demand-led growth, and that's where we have done some work in terms of how can you get domestic demand going in many of these countries in Asia. We've talked about, of course, structural reforms, but also talked about the fact that capital efficiency is declining in this region. So you want to improve capital efficiency and also make production structures a lot more labor intensive. Going beyond that, we've also done some work recently on trade integration within Asia. And if you look at what's happening in Asia, is that this is a region, we talk about tariffs, but this is a region which has huge amount of non-tariff barriers. And if you compare Asia with, say, Europe, you compare Asia with the Americas, we have very high non-tariff barriers. So what we show is that if Asia lowers non-tariff barriers, right, then there is significant potential for growth in the region. And we note that overall in Asia, the level of real GDP could go up by almost 1.5%, which is quite significant. And some regions will benefit a lot more. The ASEAN benefits a lot more because they're open, they can benefit from greater access to demand and for cheaper inputs. But South Asia, where, if you take India and the rest of the countries in the region, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal, these countries are highly not integrated. So if you lower non-tariff barriers, this region has significant room to grow just through trade integration within the region. So, you may face headwinds from outside the region, but you could do a better job integrating within the region. That's why I'm saying that countries like India can think about joining RCEP, CPTPP. All these are plurilateral arrangements which will promote trade within the region and outside. And so there is scope here, and that's something which countries need to work on. But I would say that you have to think in terms of deeper reforms. And countries like India are well placed to embark on that next set of reforms, which will yield high dividends going forward.
I think that was an interesting point you made about integration within the region. My last question then is, what is it like to work in an organization like the IMF in Trump 2.0? Are you working harder, scratching your head a little more?
So we always work hard. I mean, that's a given. And we
I'm
always
just
work
asking
hard.
whether it's more challenging.
And I think, I think that the challenging part for work on countries like India and rest of Asia is, some of the easier reforms are done. Now it's the challenge. The challenge is for deeper reforms, which will yield high dividends. So the question we always ask ourselves is, given limited political capital, how should we prioritize reforms? Which reforms will yield the most benefit? Which reforms will have greater support from the public? And we've done that country by country, and we're trying to do that more for countries in the region. And so every time we do a consultation with India or we do a consultation with Indonesia, we're asking this question is, what are the kind of reforms which are needed, which are more difficult to do, but how can we make it easier for policymakers to make advances in these areas? So I think that's a challenge for countries in Asia, and I think India included. We just finished a consultation with India, very good consultation, and there's lots of vibrancy in India. So momentum is there for reforms. Now everyone has to work together, center, state, local provinces together to make sure that that India undertakes these reforms, which will yield significant dividends going forward. I'm very optimistic.
It's great to hear that you're optimistic. I mean, politically also, that would mean a major outreach, as you said, for the center and states to work together. But may I say, you'd make a very good diplomat, how you handled that question on Trump. That was very well handled. Mr. Krishna Srinivasan, thank you very much for joining us and giving us some very important perspective and great news points on where the world economy is headed, what India needs to do to tide over this difficult period. And though, despite all the headwinds, India is still emerging in a much better position than most. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nidhi. Always a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you, Mr. Srinivasan.